Welcome, everyone. I know I'll be starting the program as I see people joining in. So first of all, such a pleasure to see all of you here today, and especially to be joined by such an illustrious group of women. I wish we could be in person, but just to see you all on the same screen is going to be wonderful. So my name is Francesca Dominici, and together with David Parks, I am a faculty co-director of the Harvard Data Science Initiative. And today's event is one of the several that we have been hosted over the past year to celebrate the Harvard Data Science Initiative 5th anniversary. In fact, today, we marked the actual 5th anniversary of our launch in 2017. And we cannot imagine a better way to celebrate that with a conversation that explores the ways in which we can use data and data science to drive change towards a more diverse and inclusive society. Our moderator today is Deanna Lee. Deanna's been a friend and advocate of the Harvard Data Science Initiative since our launch, and we are enormously grateful to her for being here today. As a graduate of the college and a former member of the board of overseers, Deanna has also been a longtime friend of the university. Over her distinguished career, Deanna has been a concert pianist, a TV news producer, and a nonprofit leader. She is the recipient of 8 Emmy Awards for her reporting and producing at ABC News, and has served in leadership roles at the New York Public Library and at the Carnegie Corporation. More recently, she was visiting artist and writer at the American Academy in Rome and visiting professor of media studies at John Cabot University. Deanna's career and the accolades that have marked it reflect her deep intellectual curiosity and her ability to connect with people in profound ways. At the Harvard Data Science Initiative, we have been so lucky to spend time with Deanna over the past 5 years, have been benefited tremendously from her generosity over time, her good humor, her sense of fun, and their genuine delight in exploring new ideas. Deanna, thank you for being here today and for leading what we know will be a fascinating conversation.
You are too kind, Francesca. Thank you so much. And a hearty welcome to everyone. We are so fortunate to have with us a superstar panel today, representing a variety of fields: publishing, academia, business, technology, journalism, which is fitting as the Harvard Data Science Initiative, which I'll also refer to as HDSI, notably spans and convenes expertise across so many disciplines to help shape the science of data. Our panel represents, I think, a kind of unusual coming together in its diversity, which sets us up for a fresh and insightful discussion, a discussion of, above all, great thinkers that I hope will be just plain fun. And there will be an opportunity for Q&A towards the end through the chat. First, the introductions. In alphabetical order, Kumsal Bayazit is the Chief Executive Officer of Elsevier, the global leader in scientific publishing, research, and health information and data analytics that promotes diversity in academic research across gender, race and ethnicity, age, geographic dimensions, and more. In short, ensuring that research is conducted and reported in the most inclusive manner possible. In the press release for Kumsal's Elsevier appointment, she was proudly introduced right off the top as the first female CEO in the company's close to 140-year history. Born and raised in Turkey, she studied economics at UC Berkeley before earning her Harvard MBA. She's held a number of senior strategy and operational roles with the RELX Group, which is Elsevier's parent company, and currently chairs the RELX Technology Forum. Kumsal has been a tireless advocate for the power of research and technology to drive positive societal outcomes, and she champions inclusion and diversity at Elsevier and beyond, though she prefers to just use the word inclusion, which we'll get into during our talk. Catherine, Katie, I hope it's okay to call you, Kaufman, is the Piramal Associate Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. In her research, Katie uses experimental methods to study individual and group decision-making with a focus on gender issues, and testing policies to close the gaps. Much of her work is on how good ideas and good candidates are only valuable when put forward. And thus, her work provides insights on how managers, policymakers, and others can design better processes for recruiting, evaluating, and promoting talent. Her work has been published in Management Science, the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and Social Choice and Welfare. It has been cited in a variety of media, including the LA Times, Slate, The Atlantic, and Pew Research. Katie is an associate editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association. Before joining HBS, she was an assistant professor at economics at Ohio State and a visiting professor of economics at Stanford. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard and a BA in mathematics and economics from Williams College. Kara Swisher is the host of Sway, the must-hear power interview podcast for the New York Times. When she launched Sway in 2020, Kara said, "Many years ago, I was one of the first reporters on the internet beat, and I watched as a bunch of nerds and misfits accumulated wealth and power the private sector hadn't seen since the robber barons of the 19th century. There's a whole world of people out there whose power goes uninterrogated. And that's my goal, not to interrogate with like Klieg lights, but interrogate, really deeply examine." Over Kara's career as a host and columnist for the Times opinion section and the Wall Street Journal as co-executive editor and co-founder of All Things Digital, then Recode, Kara has thus interrogated hundreds of newsmakers, including Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, President Obama, earning her a reputation as Silicon Valley's most feared and well-liked journalist. Though, Kara, as you have said, why should everyone emphasize fear all the time when pointing out stupid things companies are doing just makes you honest and doing your job, which we love that you are doing. Kara is the editor-at-large at New York Media and executive producer of the Code Conference. She also hosts the Vox Pivot podcast and is currently writing her third book, her memoir. Kara studied at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, then Columbia University's J School, School of Journalism. I could say so much more about all of our panelists, but in the interest of time, we are going to post the full bios in the chat. Now, to meet today's charge, as Francesca Dominici stated at the beginning, to explore the ways in which data science can drive change towards a more diverse and inclusive society, we'll be looking at insightful data science findings and applications with Kumsal and Katie. And Kara will, I hope, help hold our feet to the fire on what's at stake if the most non-inclusive, often male-dominated, competitive firms can't be convinced to change, to consider real diversity metrics, for example, as more than just what Kara has called noise around the edges. To start, to get us thinking about what is data science and the breadth of its reach across all of your fields, I wanted to ask the panelists if they might like to share an example of data science making an impact in their fields. Doesn't have to be something you've been involved with directly, but that you've just found particularly interesting. Again, alphabetically, Kumsal, anything?
Thank you, Deanna. It's a pleasure to be here. What I would say is maybe I'll give an example of peer review recommender. And I'll step back and just say at Elsevier, we're working on three things really to improve inclusion and diversity in research and healthcare communities. The first one is representation. We know that women and minorities are still underrepresented in grants and publications and professorships. The second one is around making sure gender, race, ethnicity, and other factors are factored into the research and health education. So we know that oximeters don't work on dark skins, and we know that AI technologies fail 35% of the time for Black women versus 1% of the time for white men. And then we're also working on supporting early career researchers to make sure that that come from diverse backgrounds, to make sure they can continue to excel and progress in their fields. The example I'll use today is something we call the peer review recommender. And during scholarly communications, if you have a manuscript as a researcher that you have written after you finished a research project, that gets peer reviewed before it's published. And we have millions and millions of data sets on editors, our 80,000 plus editors, actually choosing more than 1 million peer reviewers every year to actually evaluate these manuscripts. So we said, let's crank the data to see if there's actually bias in those editorial decisions. And we identified that there was bias. And we're also now using a peer review recommender to make sure that the editors can pick from a wider set of peer reviewers. But of course, when we built the peer review recommender, it was built on the data that the editors, that we had on the editors who had made all those decisions, which is what you come into. Whenever you have an AI algorithm, it always reflects the bias in the human decisions. So we've been doing, there's so much you can do with using AI and data science to get the bias out. You can measure it and you can neutralize it and you can mitigate it. But what you really need is a systems change, meaning at the point of decision through the UI experience, making sure editors are thinking through their decision from a diversity perspective. Have I evaluated women reviewers? Have I evaluated reviewers from the Global South? Have I evaluated reviewers from different stages of their career? So with a combination of UI, training and work with editors and algorithms, we're trying to make sure that we can mitigate the bias in peer review recommendations.
Thank you. And I'll have some specific questions about that for you later, because I know you've put so much effort into that, everyone at Elsevier. Katie.
Yeah, I love what Kumsal said about systems change, right? Because I think that's really where it's at. And so much of the discussion can sometimes put the onus on people to behave in different ways and start maybe taking on some of those personality features, that overconfidence that we see in these male-dominated industries. And I think really the conversation should be among leaders and managers about how we set up the systems in the first place to sort of draw in and be able to recognize, talent and excellence in all different styles. I'll give another systems change example, I think. This is an area that I've been interested in. You mentioned in my introduction this idea that sort of good ideas are only valuable if they're contributed. And, that line of research really started in thinking about test taking. And so test taking is a very simple example where you can think about, look, if you have the right answer to a test question, you're only getting credit for it if you actually put it down. It seems trivial, and yet we see on large standardized tests like the SAT, other college admissions exams, that when there are penalties for wrong answers, many test takers do skip questions, right? They're unsure about the answer and they're worried about the penalty for a wrong answer, right? Maybe due to risk preferences, maybe due to their beliefs about the likelihood of answering correctly. And so in the laboratory, I've done some investigation of this issue and looked at sort of gender differences in that propensity to skip questions. And what we see in the lab is that when there are penalties for wrong answers, women are more likely to skip questions than men, conditional on performing exactly the same under forced response, right? If you just force them to volunteer answers, you'd have two test takers with similar scores, and yet we can see disparities driven by just this propensity to guess. And what's been amazing about sort of the role of data in this is we've seen in recent years now, through no involvement of mine, many large standardized tests actually start to remove penalties for wrong answers. Now, what does that do, right? It eliminates risk preferences and beliefs from the equation because now there's no risk to volunteering your answer, right? It doesn't matter how confident you are. It doesn't matter how you feel about that downside risk. And so I've had the chance to look at data from the Chilean college entry exam. And what we see doing a before-after analysis is that after the policy change, we see a reduction in the gender gap in test scores, right? That seems to be coming through a closing of the gender gap and willingness to guess. And I think contrary to what you might expect, the gaps when there are penalties for wrong answers are often concentrated among the high ability test takers, at least in this Chilean college entry exam, right? And so it's really these sort of talented test takers who we're missing out on hearing from, and we can hear more of their ideas in this test taking context by changing the system, by changing the institution. I think it's a nice model for thinking about drawing in answers and expertise across all different contexts.
Thank you so much. Kara, you're following so much interesting tech. Is there one example of something that you would like to share that you think is particularly interesting?
Well, I spend a lot of time focusing in on where money is moving and who has money and who is making investments. And I think the statistics that really struck me and I really should be writing more about is in this area, at least with diversity and inclusion, is that in 2001, according to PitchBook, 2% of venture capital in the US in 2021 were female founders. That's the smallest since 2016. And these efforts to diversify this male-dominated industry is still problematic. It's the second year in a row that it's declined, which is it doesn't surprise me, but it also makes me worry about, if women aren't, one, getting the investments, and two, aren't on the cap table, it doesn't really matter. Nothing really matters, because really what's respected in tech, at least, or in any kind of entrepreneurial, is who owns, who controls, and who runs, essentially. And so I'm not going to say if you see it, it'll happen. That's not really what it is, but 2% is really quite something. And it's even lower for people of color. Like, that's just really, it's really quite astonishing. And that means somehow the calculation has been made that 98%, the smartest people are white men 98% of the time, and it's just not true. So that there's something happening here that is unable to be fixed in the system, especially since the products that are being made are made throughout, are actually quite evenly distributed among consumers, whether it's Twitter, whether it's that's an older product, but and the same thing is happening in Bitcoin. Of the 12 richest Bitcoin or Bitcoin, just crypto, excuse me, not Bitcoin, investors in this new Web3, whatever that's supposed to mean at this point, is happening where they're supposed to be distributing power. It's not the case at all. That's a lot of nonsense. The powerful people are consolidating power they always do, because they're not quite rich enough yet to be so enormously, ridiculously wealthy. And so I think 12 of them, all 12 are men. Only one is not white. All of them went to 8 of them went to Stanford or Harvard. Sorry, I don't mean to insult your university, but come on, are you the only smart people in this world? I don't think so. And so those are the statistics I pay attention to, is where the money is flowing and where the opportunity is, because there's talent all over the world. And I think that we don't know what we don't know, right? We don't know, people. I was on a panel yesterday at Columbia, and they were talking about what would happen if they broke up, took a piece off of Google or spun off AWS. Well, we don't, by the way, more people would be richer because they would be better, more companies, the better. But we don't know what it would be created by more innovative companies, because they won't make them, because the companies are too big that they're competing with. So you don't know what you don't know. And so I always think of this idea of talentism around the world, that there is a young woman in Pakistan that just needs the opportunity, and and I know that sounds like I'm not trying to be sort of liberal rope here, but come on, you've got to be kidding that you're not there is some person who's not getting funded who has the cure for cancer in their head, and not giving them the opportunity and limiting it to a group of people. From a math point of view, it makes no sense. It can't be that these are the most smartest people and the only people worthy of investment. And so that's something that statistic, which keeps declining, worries me rather significantly. So,
and then all the men that are working on curing cancer, they're working on curing it, thinking of male cancer patients.
Sometimes
And
I don't necessarily think that's the case anymore, but I do think that if you don't have a diversity of viewpoints, and this is not about just diversity for diversity's sake, you really can't understand. So many of the problems we have in the internet are traced to lack of, and I'm not talking about just gender diversity or racial diversity. It's age diversity, it's geographical diversity. It is, it's all kinds of stuff. It's including conservative diversity, like not having as many voices at the table, and then using these tools that were created by people who never saw a lack of safety. The reason these products are unsafe is because the people who make them never felt unsafe. So why should they make anything that's unsafe? And so that's why you have that. And that's why we've created divisive products, because these people are never touched by division. And so we end up responding to their game versus a much more civil conversation across all kinds of diverse. You can't have reasonable conversations with people across things. And it's not a left is being censorious thing, or the right has lost its ever love and mind, which in many ways it has, and the left can be very censorious, but it's that these products are made to create those divisions. And so if you don't have, it's not that women are going to create nicer products, not necessarily. I know a lot of ruthless women. It's just that, it doesn't allow you to see all the ideas, and it doesn't get funded. And therefore we get more of the same, and we're going to get that in the next era.
you talk about young women with the ideas, or people of whatever underrepresented groups that we are not hearing about. Kumsal, a huge area of your work at Elsevier is what you call the journey through research, the progression, the career progression of young academics through a gender lens. I was interested to find that you're already studying the effects of COVID on that particular area. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, going back to use of data, and I'd like to build on what Kara said too, because to me, she kind of was capturing the spirit of what inclusion means in the way you drive decision making. So there's inclusive decision making, but going to sort of representation of women, and we focused on this with gender because that's the only area where we have the data now, and we're working on actually collecting data on race and ethnicity, is we look at researchers from early career to all the way sort of 20 years after they've published their first publication. And we call that the publication age, and use it as a proxy as to whether you're an early career researcher or a more experienced researcher. And what we see is that the ratio of man to woman actually decreases over time. So more women opt out of the research ecosystem as they get more senior. If we also look, so we've been looking at this data over 10 years. We looked at 2010 and 2020. The good news is the ratios are improving. The bad news is even in the US, which is a highly developed country, for every 5 women researcher, you have 10 men researcher. That ratio was 3 to 10 years ago, so it has improved. And then if you look at that through categories of early career researchers versus late career researchers, you see that the ratios are better at about 7 for early career researchers. So if you can actually hold on to those early career researchers and make sure they don't opt out, you start getting more equal representation in the research ecosystem. So that's where we look through with the data at the end. And we also compare not only sort of stage, we compare countries. And it's really interesting. Argentina and Portugal are the best in terms of having gender equality in their research ecosystems. And then Japan and Germany are the worst. We look at developed countries primarily that are sort of research intensive. And if you that also enables us to ask questions like, what did Portugal get right? What did Argentina get right? And can we adopt some of those policies in other countries to ensure that you get gender equality at research? We also look at it by discipline. So medicine is now more women than men. Whereas if you look at energy, it's still very male dominated. And then you can also look at it through a discipline lens to say, okay, how do we actually improve representation of women in physics and chemistry and other areas as well. But that's the work we do, and we look at the data to ask the questions, to compare and contrast and identify actions. It takes a long time. It's slow work. It's very easy to get frustrated, but the needle does move in the right direction when you look at it through the lens of decades.
You are doing very timely work, though, even though it takes a long time. Coming back to what you found about the pandemic, that was kind of surprising that it was having a very marked effect.
Yeah, during the pandemic, we looked at submissions by gender, man and woman, and we could see that the increase of submissions have increased across the board during the pandemic. There was a lot of work going on, and the increase of submissions in men was significantly higher than women. So that is actually going to put that's going to hold women back, because your publication history is one of the key inputs into career progression in terms of what research you've done and what you've published. So we are seeing actually 2 years of lost time for a lot of researchers, where they were not publishing as fast as much as the men were during COVID. There are many, but also really interesting, Deanna, is a woman were peer reviewing, which is voluntary work, at the same rate as men. So that did not change. They were still contributing to the global community to make sure they were peer reviewing the work, and the work was progressing and getting published. They just weren't producing as much of their own work, obviously for a lot of reasons around childcare, being at home, or working in the field, whatever it was. And that is going to put that generation of early career researchers back. So we've actually started work this year in 7 countries in small scale sort of experimentations to see how we can pick up that generation and make sure we can help them make up for lost time.
Mm-hmm. And Katie, have you been seeing that among your colleagues in research?
Yeah, I mean, certainly anecdotally among my colleagues, but also I know there are many scholars who have been trying to study the impacts of COVID on researcher productivity and coming to very similar conclusions that Kunsal raised. I mean, in the background of the last couple of years too, we also have the huge social justice movement, right? And I think we've seen sort of disparate impacts of that on faculty time use and, professional time use in other sectors as well. And so there's, the last 2 years have been intense and demanding, and differentially so for different members of our population. And so I think there's been a lot going on, and it's highlighting the weak points in the system, right? Where it can be, when things get really challenging, right? What do we sort of lose? And we're seeing that now. I think, I connect the some of what's going on with COVID too to some really interesting work that's been done around parental leave. Another great example of sort of a system, and is the system working right? I think there's been this, big push to make parental leave, more gender neutral, right? We want to give dads time to spend, with their new child. Clearly, there's an important argument for that. But there have been some studies in academia looking at, well, what happens during that year of parental leave when it goes to a birth mother as opposed to a father, right? And what you see is the woman on parental leave is not publishing a lot of research. She is taking care of a child. And yet that can often be a very productive year for a father. He is not teaching. He has these sort of constraints, maybe even refereeing, sort of alleviated from his calendar. And so he's in his office writing papers. And so obviously that's sort of reducing it down, but there have been some works highlighting sort of, that sort of gap in publishing that can emerge even during parental leave. And I see schools now giving COVID years to various faculty members, right? And that sort of pops in my head and says, oh, is this parental leave again, where the COVID year is going to be a boon to people who do not have as many responsibilities at home, and actually, being used in a very different way for people with more caregiving obligations.
Mm-hmm. Kara, do you think that the increased responsibilities at home are responsible for the super interesting findings of Ellen Powell's group, Project Include, that you have mentioned? Basically, that 1 out of 4 tech workers found that they have been experiencing more harassment through remote work? Do you think?
I saw Ellen. I talked to Ellen about that statistics. I think harassment just continues no matter what the medium. It doesn't matter what tool you have. There, it just is a. I hate to use the word endemic, but there it is. It just never seems to end. Whatever tool some people get, not all of them by any stretch. It happens that way. You don't. It's probably easier to report. There's recordings and things like that at work. There's these very subtle things that happen. That are not data friendly, I guess, right? They don't quite know a lot of it is unfortunately anecdotal and what it happens. I just think it sort of continues on the same way as attitudes towards how women in the workplace. It's one of those things that you don't see a lot of, you see improvement, small improvements over time, but you never see it ending. I suspect being at home is probably easier in that regard. I was surprised by some of those things Ellen was saying. As to the part about, someone asked in the chat about data, I think one of the problems is it's very hard to know why is it that the numbers have dropped for women? What are their ideas, half as bad? It's really hard this stuff is so not data driven. It's so it's just, I just don't like this idea. Well, why? I don't like what I'm looking at, kind of thing. The person I'm again. I was just at dinner with someone last night, and this happens to me dozens of times when it comes to women founders. There's not a woman founder that doesn't have this story, but this is someone who's from Google, highly competent, huge job at Google. So the resume is so impressive, speaks 7 languages. Just one of these, it's the CEO of this new startup that is really good. It's just, it's a fantastic music related startup, but it's not consumer music. It's around tech. And has so many, someone's going to buy this for a lot of money, this company. You can just see it. It's just hanging off of this thing. And she was in a meeting. She's doing it with her husband. And he's the tech person. She's the CEO. And both incredibly competent executives. And she was asked in at least 4 meetings, well, how are you going to do this with the kids? They have 3 kids at home. Obviously she's wealthy beyond belief. She worked at Google from the early days. She doesn't have health. She can pay for childcare. Not that there's at some point you can't pay for enough. No matter how rich you are, you have responsibilities to your kids. Well, some people don't, but I do, for example. But she's asked by 4 VCs, how are you going to handle the working with the kids at home during COVID? How are you going to do that during this time period? Because the kids aren't in school. And literally they never asked her husband. They never asked her husband who went to the meetings that same question. It was really quite astonishing. And I know it sounds like a broken freaking record, but stop asking that question. She's perfectly competent to do her job. And she can handle it, or he can take care of the kids or whatever. And so I find that happens among people who literally should not be asked that question. This is someone who juggled thousands of employees, really can handle this, and had 3 children. These children are slightly older, was pregnant 3 times during that time. And so I'm like, I give her a friggin' medal, this woman. She ran like a big organization for a long, long time. And it was again last night, and I was like, oh, again, that question. And I couldn't believe that she's getting it quite a lot. I'm just sort of like, are you kidding me? It's just, and again, how would you translate that to data? How would you it's a story, right? How do you figure that out? And so I wonder, how did the data cut in half for women being funded? How did that happen? It has to be, they're just half as stupid as the other people, or their ideas are half as bad. And you're sort of like, it can't possibly be the case. So it was just it's interesting to try to put it to data, which I think is where people feel more comfortable if they can point to a number.
Right, but then we have to go beyond the numbers too. But let's get into culture and inclusion. Let's get into some of the tough questions that there are not necessarily answers for. Kumsal, you said you wanted to pick up on inclusion earlier, and I just wanted to start with what I said in the introduction. Explain why you do not like saying diversity and inclusion.
Diversity is an outcome, and you got to get inclusion right to drive diversity. So if you focus on diversity, I think you're missing the spirit of what you're trying to achieve, which is an inclusive culture, which means everybody has equal opportunity, regardless of who they are, and everybody feels equally comfortable in their own skin, regardless of what their background is. And if you don't get that inclusion part right, I think it's very hard to drive diversity. I also find that when you focus on diversity, you may focus on gender diversity or racial diversity or disability diversity, and all of them are equally important. And if you focus on inclusion, what I have found is you can actually lift all boats in terms of different types of diversity. So you get more, for lack of a better word, you get more bang for your buck, because you're actually focusing on inclusive behaviors and an inclusive culture and an inclusive workplace or an inclusive community. And then that naturally drives diversity.
Is that one of the ideas that came with when Kumsal and I had a brief discussion earlier, and you told me that when you became CEO, and again, the first woman in close to 140 years of Elsevier's history, that was a big deal. It was a big deal for employees, and yet you felt you really had to step up your game.
Yeah.
How did you do that, and what was that about?
Yeah, I still need to step up my game, but in terms of how I think that the epiphany for me is I advocated for women my entire career. I am a woman. I understood what it was to come up the ranks as a woman. And then when I became the CEO of an organization with 8,500 people, I realized I had to advocate equally for everyone. So I couldn't actually focus on gender. I had to advocate equally for gender equality and race and ethnicity and disabilities and LGBTQI and age and nationality and on and on and on. And I think it was really important for people to understand that there was similar and equal focus, because we're talking about equal opportunity across all of these dimensions. And when I took over at Elsevier, they were at different maturities. So for us, LGBTQIA+ was very, very mature and in a really good place. Gender came after, and we really were behind in race and ethnicity. So depending on where we were, we had to take different actions. But it was a big awakening for me, because I would do a lot of these also external advocacy work for gender, and I had to become quite knowledgeable, even though it wasn't my own experience, on things like race and ethnicity and disabilities as well, so I could advocate both for the communities we serve as well as our own people at Elsevier.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about some of those other parameters that you've worked into your Scopus,
yes.
Scopus service
Yes.
in a second. I also want to get to Katie, because you are doing some of the work that I think can really move forward that both employees, colleagues, bosses. A lot of your work is actually surprising, that maybe some of what we're doing in terms of all these this anti-bias training and feedback, we've still got a long way to go, and you are, through data, learning some super important things. But before we get to the good news, Kara, you're bringing up the Google executive is, it's distressing, because as you say, we've all heard things like this, but it is shocking that somebody at her level is getting that. I want to talk a little bit about what is going on at some of the companies like Google. It seems like, they're not the only ones, whether it's Basecamp, Google, Coinbase, over and over again, we are seeing companies that are kind of talking the talk, but when it comes to walking the walk, when issues come up, diversity and inclusion issues come up, it's like they're flummoxed at best, and then workers end up leaving, and it's not getting any better.
No, not at all. Just so you know, we're enjoying the view of Rome behind you, but you're fuzzy right now. Just so you know. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Is anyone else seeing that or not? Sure, you're fuzzy.
Sometimes camera on off fixes it at the end.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
Rome, I think that's Rome is lovely. So there you go. There you go. I'm sorry, I got flummoxed by that. So it's interesting because I have a saying that I say over and over and over again, which is, it's not a meritocracy, it's a mirrorocracy, right? It's but people who are comfortable with people. And you know what? I get it. I get it. People are more comfortable with people who are like them. It's just, it's just the way humans can be, don't have to be. And it's the smallest way to be only comfortable in a set of people that you feel like you belong with. That said, what happens is they stack rank these things. Stack ranking is a big thing in Silicon, or whatever the expression they use, or KPIs, and it's on there. Diversity is on there. It's like, but it's like 10, and it's not 1. It's never 2, and it's always like fobbed off to a chief diversity officer. And those people, oh my, I feel bad for them. They have very little power. And it's like having a chief ethics officer at Facebook or something. It's just, you don't have power. You don't have any way to change. And you're sort of you jam up the growth, you jam up this, you jam up that. And I think what's interesting that what's happening, which I think is a really fascinating trend, especially since COVID, is the power of the employees has changed rather significantly. And so employees have more input and more power with employers, because first of all, there's not, employment is at record low in this area. It was already low. And so that, you have to really compete for people. They're trying to do that with money now and other things. But a lot of people like to, or where you work, or if you're at work or not, or whether you're remote or whatever, that's all going to be sorted out. I suspect we're going to have a very remote workplace going forward, much more so than people realize. And then when people meet, it has to have intentionality, which will be interesting to see what happens to how people interact. And so I just, they do. It's not lip service precisely, because I think they're very much committed to it. I do see a difference in younger founders who really do build it in from the beginning. You just do. And it's not perfect, but it's certainly much better. I think people, when you look around and the people you find comfort in, you put around you, especially as you rise higher in an ecosystem, you want loyalty around you. And it's usually the people who have stuck with you. That's also a problem, because people violently agreeing with each other is not a good thing for a very powerful CEO to be part of. And so anyone that puts their hand up, it becomes difficult, becomes problematic or dramatic, and it's often put onto a woman, and has to bring up those issues of inclusion. And so I think it's if they don't, and they're like, we're trying to find people, we can't find people, but that's not true. They're not trying. I have a very similar issue when I try to get people for my events. I tried very hard. Now, look, my group of people at the Code event it's going to be white guys, a lot of them, because that's who runs these big companies, or not everybody, but it's still just the facts. And so we have the CEOs of the big companies. But I've actually started a new one called PivotCon, essentially, for my pivot thing, where I'm just focusing on. I'm loving it because I can really pull from a much more diverse group of people, and not just diverse for diversity's sake. Again, because that minimizes, people think, oh, you're just doing that. It's because it's a much more interesting cross section of people that you can talk to, and people are much more open-minded in that regard. I don't know, I don't like to assume that people are trying to do it, but it just happens. And I'll recall a piece I wrote when I started doing Recode. I could do whatever I wanted, and so I just started to. And one of the pieces I wrote was the men and no women of Facebook. And all I did was put up their pictures in a big row. And this is the story. And I said, look at this guy. He looks different from this guy because he's wearing a different colored shirt. It was very funny. And then there was it was white guy, I think Asian guy, white guy. It was, I forget. It was maybe an Indian guy, but it was funny. And I got this is pre Sheryl Sandberg, who apparently represents 5 women. And so they call me that's not fair. I'm like, all I did was publish your executive for people to visually see what's happening. And I get that they made all kinds of pipeline, this, that, blah, blah, blah. And that is, I understand that it's hard to find people. I get that. But then I did one on boards of Web 2.0 companies, which was this new class of entrepreneurs. Again, same thing. And boards, for the love of Pete, you can find diverse boards. You can, that's not as hard. You can pull from all kinds of industries and this and that. And one of the one of the founders, I think it was the Groupon, who has since crashed, that company since crashed, was like, can you help me find them? Like, and I was like, do you think I have binders of women or people of color? Like, yes, no, you can find them. It was so like, it was like talking to a toddler on some level. Oh, I think this is important. And what was interesting about it was that was an area where you could, it means you're doing it. It means you're actually trying not to be diverse. And so I don't know what I think it's a bother. It's like, oh, that again. And if you don't start it from the CEO and make it the C, everybody know people are very attuned to what the leader wants. And so the leader says it over and over and over again, in some way that it's whether it's punitive or rewarding of that, it works. It does. I often, when I see a list of people bring to me for my conference and it's not diverse enough in all kinds of ways, including conservatives, I just hang up. I'm like, I gotta go. Come back when you have what I asked for, and then I hang up. And the next day it's there. You know what I mean? Like, that's my way of doing it because I'm an asshole. But it's it works. It works if you from the top say that, and it's because you are trying to do a better version of what you're doing.
But if it's incentive for staff, if the CEO is doing it, I mean, what about incentive for the CEO? I mean, I know in your UC course where you teach on what you call the techpocalypse, that there just so much of it, there is just no incentive for more monitoring of data and content data. Is it the same with inclusion? Is there enough incentive for the CEO to say what
would be the incentive? What would it be that they get that you legislate it? That seems not going to happen. It's happened in other countries and it works. You know what I mean? That seems like the right wing would love juicy lawsuit on that one. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's hard. It's hard to, you have to grow. You know, there's a Frederick Douglass quote. I'd rather grow strong. It was about, I think it was about men. I don't have the exact quote. I'd rather grow strong men than fix broken ones later. Right. And so, you know, I have 4 children, and I talk a lot about it with them. Like, how do I get them that way? I talk about it and I let them disagree with me constantly. They always disagree with me, unfortunately, but you allow it to be talked about. And I think one of the problems is it's become super sensitive to talk about too, because everyone feels slightly uncomfortable now and everything. And that's another issue that we have to figure out, how we can have a civil discussion about what's right in front of everyone's face. I don't know quite. I think it has to come from leadership, because we are a leader following nation. We just are. I mean, we just are, even though we pretend we're not, we are. And I don't think it should be up to women leaders to do it. I think it has to come from men. I think it has to, I think, didn't Harvard have some thing with the worst named thing ever, Manbassadors at the Harvard Business School? Manbassadors, that men were part of the inclusion. I thought it was the worst word of ever. But nonetheless, that was an effort. I don't quite know what would, I think ultimately you have to be more capitalistic. It should benefit them in some way.
And that's what I think where Katie's work, right? Katie is doing work that I think you can present to a CEO and you can say, here is concrete data and analysis of what you think about changing people's beliefs, what you think about your feedback program maybe isn't working. And I'm going to tell you why. Katie, talk about some of these findings that you've come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting having this conversation across fields and perspectives. And I saw a couple of the questions come up too, which is, you know, well, how do we know what's going on, right? Is it, you know, women aren't sort of going for it? Is it discrimination? Like what's happening, like in the funding example, right? And yes, we have those anecdotes and those stories. Maybe we have raw data. But then in this world of academia, right, there are lots of researchers trying to dig into this and understand what's going on. And, you know, in the funding example, one of my favorite studies by some of my colleagues here, you know, thinks about like a pitch, the exact same pitch given by a woman versus a man, right? How is that received? And they see differential treatment depending on the gender of who's giving that pitch, right? So you hear the audio, you see the visual, and it's evaluated in different ways. And we have evidence that men, male and female founders get asked different questions, right? That men differentially get asked about opportunities for growth, right? How big is this market? And women get asked about sort of everything that could go wrong, right? So I think we have pretty strong evidence from rigorous academic studies that discrimination is an important channel, at least in some of these contexts. And I think that's an important thing to highlight, that it's not just that people aren't putting themselves forward, although that could be part of what's going on in some of these environments as well. Certainly to the extent that that's true, right? Those two things go hand in hand. Well, why am I not putting myself forward? Because I have a bunch of stories about where it hasn't gone well for the people who have put themselves forward before me. So, when you think about sort of bringing data to the questions around organizational change, I think you do want to make the argument, right, that there are sort of missed opportunities here, right? And if we can find ways to better capitalize on the talent we have or the talent we could have in our organization, we can all be better off, right? And I'll share an anecdote in place of the data, but I think there's data to back this up as well. I've done a lot of work on sort of contribution to teams, right? Who volunteers their ideas, and so you could think about a manager running a team trying to do sort of a forecasting task, right? Like, how many sort of blue parkas are we going to need in this department store? And a professor at Wharton was sharing this anecdote with me that, even just casually speaking with leaders, they had noticed, right, that they would have these sort of meetings to do these forecasting problems, and the same people would sort of say, oh yeah, we're going to need 75. And the forecasting was not going well, right? It's like, okay, we're off every time. And they could do better by sort of getting rid of the meeting, where maybe everyone is better off that way anyways, but just privately soliciting everyone's ideas beforehand, right? So that you're not necessarily just hearing from the loudest voice, the person who's most willing to speak up first. You're hearing from everyone, and you can use all of that information. And ex post, you can evaluate all of those forecasts as well, and sort of use that to your advantage going forward. And I think that's just, it's an anecdote, but a nice model for how we can think about, all right, are we relying too much in our organizations on sort of self-selection, right? Who raises their hand first, who puts themselves forward for the stretch assignment, who says they're ready to go up for that promotion, right? I think so much of what we've built in a lot of these organizations is built to reward people who are confident or overconfident. And it's not always clear that the people who are most confident are the ones who are most skilled or who would do the best job. And so I think we've got to separate those two things and start building systems around identifying talent rather than selecting on confidence. You're muted, Deanna, sorry.
Thank you. You do a lot of work about confidence and even the stereotypes that we have about ourselves. Kumsal, you've talked about how your mentors really stressed with you the need to be authentic. It's sort of like, what is authenticity to you when you talk to your mentees, Kumsal, and how do you work being authentic and raising your hand with confidence into being like the song that begins Kara's podcast is about, when you walk into a room, do you have sway? So Kumsal, how do you tell your mentees, how do you have sway?
It has been a journey. So I think I shared this with you, Deanna. It's a story I share a lot with my mentees too. When this was probably a decade ago, when I was at that point where I would have been evaluated to become a senior executive in the company, we had a management development process with a 360 review, which is a very helpful process. And at the end, you sit down, 20, 30 people were interviewed, and you have a conversation with your boss around what's working and what else do you need to develop to get to that next level. And the feedback my boss gave me was, well, you're too nice. You're too nice. So are you going to be able to make the tough decisions? And first I listened.
I get the opposite. Keep going.
And I think the point
Like
is
I give a
that
fuck, but okay.
it doesn't matter whether you're nice or tough, right? You just need to kind of play to whatever feels comfortable to you. But that was the feedback I got was you're too nice. And I didn't say anything during the meeting. And then I went away and it really didn't sit well with me, that feedback really didn't sit well. And I went back and talked to him the next day and I said, this is who I am. This is my style. I can be very effective, very successful, and drive as good an outcome as anybody else, if not better, being nice. So I'm not going to change this. You're going to see me as the velvet hammer. I can make the tough decisions, but I'll make them in a very nice way. And that is the story I share with my mentees to say, if you are trying to change who you are, you can't actually do a good job. So to me, in the workplace, substance is what matters. It's not the style. So I really try to stay away from giving feedback on style. I think you need to be aware of your style and the impact your style has on people. And that's what I call authenticity, is sort of be who you are. You can be blunt, you can be nice, you can be tough, you can be loud, you can be quiet. What we need to really focus on is what is the substantive value that you're creating for the business, for your teams, and the results that you're driving. And that's what we have to focus on as we progress people through their careers. Instead of telling them, be nicer, be tougher, be quieter, be louder, be more competent, be less confident, be yourself, but focus on substance.
Mm-hmm. Now, while I've got you, I do want to come back to Elsevier's Scopus platform because it is a concrete tool to address some of the things we've been talking about, at least in academia, but I think there are similar models that could be applied to how journalists pick talking heads or, you know, anything, how you choose from a database of photographs. So tell us a little bit about Scopus. Sorry, I think I was combining Scopus and SciVal. Right, but let's focus on Scopus for the moment, and how you're using it to help people. Maybe this is too strong a word, but to help sort of matchmake writers with expertise and maybe help people overcome what they don't know that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scopus is where the data piece comes into play. I don't necessarily think it helps with the behaviors. That's more the user experience and making sure at decision points we do highlight.
Oh, but that's exactly what I want you to talk about.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's
the interesting part. Yeah.
Of course, and maybe I'll use sort of the peer review as a data set. Scopus has data on 17, 18 million authors, has about 1.7 billion data points, and it's actually scientific literature that's curated because we have independent experts for each discipline that actually review the journals and decide that it is high quality enough to be admitted into the Scopus database. So it's a quality curated database of about 7,000 journals. And in those journals, of course, there's a wealth of information about authors because we know who the author is, we know what discipline they worked on, we know who they collaborated with, we know where they were published, we know which institutions they were affiliated with. And through machine learning AI algorithms, we can actually extract a lot of these entities and build networks. And we've also been able to, the reason why we can do the gender research is we've used machine learning to be able to identify author names and assess and assign gender to those author names. That's not perfect, but it's good enough to give us some really compelling data. In Scopus, so when we now work on peer review selection at a journal, we want to make sure that is inclusive and a diverse set of peer reviewers are selected, and the editor doesn't default back to who they know, or going back to Kara's, the mirror who I'm comfortable with, but actually who are potential experts that I may not know who can actually evaluate this manuscript effectively. And for that, what we have done is we chose 3 dimensions that we can actually measure on from Scopus, which is we call it geolocation, not nationality, because we want to make sure that Global South is represented as well. There are a lot of, so I'm a Turk who's Harvard educated. I'm not your audience. Actually, it's the Turkish academics who are at a Turkish university when we talk about diversity that you want to get into the fold. So we can actually identify geolocation of the author based on where they first published their first article, how long they've been a researcher, and then gender. And as peer reviewers, so we can actually build recommendation systems that gives recommendations for peer reviewers based on historical decisions that editors have made. But what we have noticed is the algorithms are always going to have the bias, and they're going to reflect the human bias in those decisions. Now, through the user experience, we're actually telling the editors, as you find your peer reviewers, please take into consideration these diversity. And here is a search where you can dial things up and down by gender, by nationality, by geolocation, to sort of look at different populations and get the relevant information on those authors' level of expertise to see if they are able to review the manuscript. And for that, going back to Katie's point, systems change. You need AI and data. You need a user interface that's top of mind, that asks every editor every time they're making a decision to actually consider diversity. And then we do a lot of training with our editors around this. And we have also asked each of our journals to have a diversity pledge, which means they, as a group of editors, discuss how they want to improve the diversity of who they're publishing, who is peer reviewing, and what the journal is covering. So that's where we're trying to do a systemic change to make sure that the representation of peer reviewers get more diverse in the scholarly.
And because we've been talking a lot about, how do you get people to want to change or want to buy in this? Even anecdotally, are you feeling that people using the platform that maybe did not think in a certain way when they first signed up to the service, are they changing?
Yeah, I think what I sort of say, the rule of thumb, a third, and Katie will be upset with me because this is definitely not rigorous academic research, but usually a third welcomes the change and a third is sort of neutral and watches it, and you need to get them enthusiastic about it, and a third really doesn't want to change. Now that's sort of probably representative, and you have to work differently with each of those communities. What I have found is the more elements of diversity you can cover, the higher the population you can capture and get passionate about this. Because if it's gender, you may have a daughter, or you may be a woman. If it's race and ethnicity, you may be from a minority group. If it's nationality, you may come from a global South country or have connections there. So the more you can cover different elements of diversity, I think the more you're going to have people care about making diverse decisions at the point of the decision. So that's a rule of thumb we follow to get more people excited. But I mean, we did this summer a pilot on race and ethnicity and collection of data from our authors to see if they were willing to give us that data so we can start analyzing that. And we create the global race and ethnicity schema, which is no easy feat. And 50% gave us very positive feedback on the pilot and said, we'll share this data and we think it's great that you're doing it. About 50% said either we shouldn't need this data because it should all work without the data because there shouldn't be any bias, or I just want to publish my research, why are you asking for this data? So 50%, I was actually pleasantly surprised that 50% was willing to do this. And we're now gonna actually start scaling that pilot to get more data and see if we can have the kind of tracking for race and ethnicity that we do for gender and measure progress. I think measuring progress is really important, Deanna. I think if you can look at percentages and look at those numbers, how do we care? I look at those numbers constantly and I ask questions about why is this not progressing? Why is that not progressing? I think that's a way to make sure people care. As Kara said, if the CEO cares and you're asking the questions around why the progress is not there, then people problem solve and you start making the progress.
And very briefly, because it is important, the platform does use machine learning, but how do you make sure, because of course there's humans create algorithms, how do you control for that or curate?
So we are
design.
We're evolving that, and we actually have a wonderful data scientist who sort of raised her hand and said, well, I think there's actually bias in these algorithms and we need to do X, Y, and Z. And we pulled her out and we put her under our general counsel so that she has real mandate and authority to work across the organization. And she is now working our way through saying, okay, where do we use algorithms? For each algorithm do we use? How do we ensure? What is the decision that algorithm drives? Is it an important decision? Is it a decision that may introduce bias? Is it a decision that may take away from equal opportunity for all? And in which case, how do we actually track and measure the bias in the algorithm and either stop using it or improve it over time? That's the process that we follow.
Mm-hmm. And Kara, what about in big tech? I mean, I was surprised, I think last month to hear, maybe I should not have been, I don't follow this that closely, but that another Google ethical AI researcher had left the company, citing, lack of diversity and inclusion. This is after two people were fired like a little over a year ago. Like, why is this still happening?
I don't know. Why are we having a war right now in Eastern Europe? I don't know. It seems like we've had them there before. And it didn't go well for anybody. I haven't looked into that story. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of that. But I did a really interesting interview with Timnit and some others at Google when there was the Google walkout. I had
who was one of the women, the two women a year and a half ago,
she
right?
Said they said she offered a resignation. She did not. Who knows? You know what I mean? It was not good.
Right.
It was not a good exit in any case. And then one was for accessing data. They kind of caught her on something, I think. I think one of the issues is, are they actually committed to that? Or is it just, they created a panel that was full of like crazy choices that they were trying to. It's almost like they're like, we need one of these and one of these and what that. I think they must be in a room doing that rather than trying to figure out who's the best people to talk about these issues. I don't think they're not unconcerned about the issue, but it's more of a PR issue for them than an actual thing. I think, it's like, oh, we got to look like we care about ethics because this could be real bad, especially with facial recognition. And obviously that data is so obvious what's happening. Even anecdotally, you can go on Google and type. It was interesting. Years ago, remember the whole thing when you type CEO into Google, and it was all white guys. Now I just did it the other day. My son and I did it. We were just curious. And it may have been, we did it on his and mine, and we got the same because it was different people asking, because but I don't ever sign into Google anything, so it probably didn't know it was me. But it was interesting because there were a lot of women in it suddenly, but no people of color. You know what I mean? It was fascinating. I was like, okay, they've done something here that suddenly, the woman was the top pick for CEO. It was of course the same woman, leaning over the desk, looking very stern. Right. But that's okay, whatever. I don't know what happened there. I think they have a commitment to it, but it's not a live or die commitment, right? It's just not. And so when they seem to find fault in the people. They're hiring difficult people, and then they're like, I can't believe you're so difficult, like about these issues, or so passionate about them. The same thing with Frances Haugen, who was not fired at Facebook. She left. Was, how could you be so difficult? How can you be, you know what I mean, when you push back? And I think a lot about when I think about newsrooms and things like that, I think about editorial tension now is so fraught with everything else. You can't just have a disagreement anymore. It's either you're Trump or not Trump, or you're white, you're black, you're this. It's really difficult. And I think perhaps they don't want to have a real discussion about it because then you everything floods into the workplace. And that's, at Coinbase, they just said, we're not talking about politics at all, which is also insane. Because, bring your true selves to work, except not that part of yourself. That's kind of an interesting message they put out there. But I don't know. I think they're committed to it, but not as anything but surface committed to it. And I think they just would like to be ahead. And so it's just whatever you're, just like with search, if you do the architecture of it doesn't make it so that's their priority. And so if it's not your priority, you can think about it in your regular life. It's like, I really want to clean that closet, but I'm not going to it's on my list. And that's how it feels like. That's a bad closet, but I'm going to go over here and do this today. And so I think that's what happens within these companies. They're moving so fast. They're trying to compete on so many levels. This is a thing that slows them down. And so, when you're in there as someone who is a difficult person who's looking for problems, you're going to become the problem within a company pretty quickly because you're saying things that are slowing people down. You're a bummer, I guess, in some way. So.
Right. I want to transition to the Q&A, but I'm going to do that with Katie in that let me reference, we've had a person thank the panel because he says he watches discussions like this because he's trying to learn for his own child and for his daughter. And Katie, so that sort of brings to mind, I mean, among all your work, there's so many interesting things, but one thing is, and this comes back to kind of mentorship of young people, sponsorship. You actually have some concrete findings that might suggest that companies need to design sponsorship or mentorship programs differently, that sponsorship does not close the gender gap in competitiveness or earnings. Can you just sort of briefly talk about maybe what sponsorship programs could be doing, one positive thing, and then we'll move to questions.
Yeah, the study you're referencing is work within the laboratory, trying to understand the ways in which, what are sort of the mechanisms through which you could nudge people to be more competitive, to put themselves forward more. And what we see in that study is simply men responding more so than women, right? And so when you provide these sorts of programs, to a full population, do we expect that to close the gap or widen the gap, right? And what we see in our data is because men are responding more, the implementation of the stylized sponsorship program that we implement is not particularly effective in closing the gap. Now, that's not to say that sponsorship as rolled out in organizations may not be effective, right? It very well could be, but I think we still need to understand better what are the channels through which that operates, right? And I think, certainly there's a clear argument for sponsorship beyond mentorship, in the sense that the advocacy that comes with sponsorship comes from having a real stake, right, in seeing your sponsee succeeding. And I think, while we may not have laboratory evidence that speaks exactly to the effectiveness of that channel, there are lots of clear models you could write down as to why that would be an important feature, right? You want to give them a reason to be invested. I think it's exactly connected to the conversations that we've been having here. And so, I think there is an important role for sponsors, for allies more generally, in many of the issues we've touched on today, right? And Kara mentioned sort of being labeled as the difficult one. If you have a bunch of other voices who, when you volunteer that, are saying, hey, that is really important, and some of those voices are powerful, who have reputations in the firm as not being a troublemaker, right? As someone who shares the priorities of much of the leadership team, well, then the whole tenor of that conversation changes, right? And so I think getting that investment, getting that buy-in from as broad a group and as diverse a group as possible in championing these issues is just crucially important for seeing these things actually succeed.
Okay, thank you. Buy-in is a big topic in our questions, but let me start first. A question came in, presumably for you, Kara. Do you have data to show that women are being denied, or are there not enough women going for financial opportunities, as there is a huge difference?
Sorry. Yeah. I saw that, there's the numbers are just the numbers. And it's just the only thing you can assume, the 2%, it was at 4, it was at 6, now it's at 2. Are there just women not going for it? No, I know tons and tons of women. They get roadblocks. And so I think you don't know who didn't get it and why they didn't get it. Because some of these early investment decisions are very, they don't rank them. Oh, I didn't pick that woman. I didn't pick that. You don't know who didn't get it. And so there's no availability of that data anywhere, but except that the numbers keep dropping. And so the only thing you can conclude from those numbers is that women have bad ideas, or people of color have bad ideas. Or maybe something else is happening here, is that when there's more money than ever in Silicon Valley to shove down any rat hole, and there's a lot of rat holes, let me just say it's not the case that's not available. And what's interesting is there's a bunch of now women-led VC firms, not Mackenzie Bezos, Melinda Gates has one that's focused on women and diverse investments. There's several funds now focused on that. And so it'll be interesting to see how well, like Aileen Lee is killing it, like at her thing. And that's one of the things she put in. It's a differentiator for her, and she's finding great success. And so I think what the problem is you can't record some of it. I don't think it's for lack of people not thinking of ideas. I don't think it's for lack. I just don't. There's lots of ideas. It's when you get this one last night this is going to be bought by Google for $1 billion. I'm sure of it, or Spotify. This is a killer idea. And she was getting those things. It's just like her husband went to the different same meeting and didn't get that question. What happened there? And how can you record that? And so that's the problem in a lot of these things is it sort of reminds me of, I'll wade into a controversial area, but when the videos of police beating people started showing up, no one quite believed it until the videos showed up. But then even then they didn't believe it. They're like, well, but, so to get the proof of it happening is really quite difficult. And again, I think most of these women don't want to get dragged into that. They just have a good idea. They want the funding. The other part that's important is just look at cap tables. There's all kinds of data on that. Who owns these companies? And who made companies that then they can reach down and invest in other companies? There's plenty of data on cap tables. And that just tells a story of one group of people benefiting over a vast amount of others. So why are those cap tables like that? And these are who gets funded, not who gets funded, who owns these companies and who gets the opportunity. Those are rather clear. And then if you go to any venture firm, just pull up the picture of the page of the people. Many of them are trying really hard to do that, but then look at their titles, look at what they actually do. When you pull up the actual, I've noticed they've tried
mix them up. Yeah.
It's very Benetton ad suddenly at venture firms, but the United Colors of Benetton, but they are, if you look at who has power, it's the same thing. Like if you pull them out, I do that all the time to see who has actual power at these firms. It's not to say they're not trying. I'm not at all. I'm not someone that's like, don't think they're not trying. It's just, I keep trying to figure out, and it ultimately comes down to they're ignoring actual data about how well companies do when they're more diverse and they make more. I try to appeal to their greed is where I like to appeal, not their guilt. We don't need guilt. You don't want to have someone be somewhere and feel like they're not as good or have that perception. You want to show them that these companies do better than they do. And again, I'm seeing a very different story in new startups. I do. I see an intentionality at the beginning that they think it benefits them and their product to have a more diverse outlook. And again, not just gender, not just race, across. Right. They just are better. They're just better. They do better. And there's lots of data on that. I don't know the latest, but there's tons and tons of data on that.
Which is starting to get at what somebody else asked. Are there other ways to reward risk-taking than how much capital you put in?
What do you mean? How would you?
I'm assuming they're saying you reward it by showing the value and other things. I don't know. Let me read the entire question. What mechanisms might compensate for the lack of diversity across the holders of capital and wealth? Are there other ways to reward risk-taking than how much capital you put in?
Meaning, why is it a risk? It's interesting because one of the things that I wrote a story, I tell the story a lot. It's actually in my book that's coming up, where I wrote it. I looked at the board of Twitter, which was struggling. Twitter was struggling to. It's always it's always hair on fire over at Twitter for many years, and it still doesn't. It's not as valued as what it does contribute, which is kind of interesting. It's been kind of a business over the years. And so there were 10 white men on the board of Twitter. This is a service that is used across all of the same type. It was really interesting. And so I was interested in boards, and because you can get diversity there, viewpoints, etc. And so I wrote a piece where I said, this is mathematically impossible. How did this happen? And I wrote a lead that I always joke I should have retired right after I wrote this. And I said, here on the board of Twitter, there are 3 Peters and a Dick. There were 3 men named Peter and a Dick, and I just and I was the editor of the publication, and so I was like, I never would have made it in the New York Times or anywhere else, but I was the editor and I was the writer, and I'm like, good job, writer. Thank you. I think I'll put that in. Publish just like that. And so, which is great to have power, by the way, FYI. If you have power, you can do what you want and suffer the consequences or not, or get the accolades. And so I got a call from the CEO of Twitter, Dick Costolo, at the time. And he was a stand-up comic, and he goes, I got to say that was a great joke. And it's not fair. I'm like, why isn't it fair? I'm just pointing out that, like, you literally have 3 people named Peter on the thing and you're the Dick, obviously. And so we had a long discussion about this. I said, we have problems getting, I'm like, come on. This is there. I can name 400 women in media. You're a media company, this and that. And by the way, your 10 men are not, bathing themselves in glory. Your company's a friggin' mess. It's going like this. And so I don't see that they're doing that good a job as a board very much. So, so he said, he goes, we have to have standards. And when he said that out of his mouth, and this is a great guy, let me just say, I said, why is the word standard only applied to women and people of color? It's really interesting. I said, by your definition, your group of people are it's a clown car over there. Your board of directors is a clown car. And they have no standards. That's clear because they're not monitoring this company properly. And it was a really great discussion we had about this, because when I said it, I think he was like, oh, I guess I do that, don't I? I was like, why is it their standards? But when it's this, it's because they were picked because they were the best. I said, how could they be the best people possible? Just really, like, you couldn't find smart anybody else. Like you, and I think once you break it down like that, it was very thoughtful discussion we had about it. And so that's how I think about it. Like, what would reward him? Me hitting him? What's the reward for thinking hard about a mistake you made and then admitting it and then fixing it? I always think money is the way it goes. Money.
So the next question does get at how do we answer people so that they come back at us like he did to you, saying, oh, I do that, don't I? And the question is, and I think this can apply to all of our panelists, as a senior woman leader in academia, I too experienced too many times the questions, how can you do your job while caring for your daughter? The question is, how do you all think I could respond to make an impact? Kamsal, would you like to go first?
She's the nice one. So don't ask.
Yes, the nice person.
The nice person. I have asked that question. I've answered that question nicely when it's been asked to me, but I said, when you ask me that question, that actually makes me feel like you doubt my ability to be able to do my job and take care of my children. And this question, by the way, is usually asked to me, at least as sort of a compliment or in awe. How can you manage having a global CEO job and 2 children? And how did you manage this job when you had 2 young children? I think this is the Pollyanna in me, assume good intent that they are genuinely surprised because that hasn't been their experience. But I try to explain why that question is infuriating and not helpful, and it's not a compliment. So I just answer it that way.
Okay. And Katie, you have studied ways, your studies give implications for how managers might offer feedback and design better anti-bias programs. How would you, if somebody came to you asking you this same question, what do you think would make a difference?
Yeah, I guess I'd start by saying, I get this question from my students and from colleagues. And, I think it's important to say out loud that I don't like the idea that any one individual is obligated to use their own career to make change, especially early in their career or when they aren't in a position of power or leadership within a firm. Like, it's not on you to fix gender bias in your firm in every conversation you have at every moment. Like, that's not a fair burden for anyone to carry. That said, right, you may get to a point in your career or be one of the bold who starts their career that way, that does want to make a change. And I think I share a lot of Kumsal's reaction, which is I think we all recognize that people put their foot in their mouth in all sorts of ways, including ourselves. And so I try, particularly for people who I have no reason to suspect they're a bad person or out to make me feel bad. To give them that moment of grace and say, hey, you may not realize that, but you're making it feel like, that somehow I'm bearing all the weight of the kids in my house, and it just doesn't seem fair to me. I probably didn't realize that's how it came across. And you want to bring them onto the team. You want the team to be bigger, and I at least that's how I would approach it. And I want to recruit them to the cause. Now, when you get to a place where you realize they are not a member of the team, the conversation changes, right? And at that point, I think, again, you have to think about powerful allies and trying to sort of implement change on a broader scale beyond trying to change just one, bad apple individual in the organization.
Okay. Thank you all very much. I'm going to perhaps end with one last question, but I'm going to make it more general than it was towards helping us to sort of wrap up. How do we ensure that so much good research in data science, that we have the problem that research papers too often are not leading to concrete societal change? How do we do that? And we don't have a lot of time, just a couple minutes. So sort of whoever wants to speak first, how do we make sure that people like Kara find out about good research, and then people like consumers like me find out about it also from her? Anyone, whoever speaks first.
I mean, I think it's great to have all this research, but to drive the change, you actually got to do the hard work of moving the needle every single day. In my experience with IND, there are no silver bullets. So you got to make small, boring, incremental moves repetitively that are not sexy or interesting, but cumulatively, they actually do move the needle towards a more inclusive environment and better diversity as an outcome.
Kara, I would not have known about the Project Include findings if it hadn't been for Sway.
Yeah, I don't know. Just, it's hard. There's so much research out there, and it's hard to know which is the good research and the bad research. I think it was interesting because I think Frances Haugen did some interesting things by showing internal research from Facebook, because that was super interesting. And of course, it blew up like a Roman candle, and now it's whatever, kind of thing. They just move along. But I think one of is I'm super interested in some of these bills for transparency from some of these companies, because they have all the data. They have all the really good data, right? And right. So on everybody, like Google knows we're here today, right now. Like, they know, everybody knows what you're doing. And so I think getting data transparency from some of these big companies, I think would go a long way with these data collecting or sucking companies, would go a long way to doing that. And there's some bills, and I think Amy Klobuchar has one. I'm not fully up to speed on all the legislation, but I think it's really important to highlight stuff. Sometimes things that are a little too, the teen girl stuff that Frances Haugen put out got a lot more attention, and the research we'll see, like it's still not out there properly. There's not enough research, but the stuff on how it affects other countries, not the teen girl stuff about how Facebook's platform was much more significant and clear what it was doing, and that didn't get attention. That's a function of the media and politicians who are like, teen girls, we love them, let's protect them, except if they're trans, let's not protect them if that's the case. But that, you know, it's unfortunately a function of what gets attention. And so I think if people, I assume people are smarter, average people are smarter than we give them credit for. And if we keep getting, I think we sort of disrespect people if we think they're stupid, like most of the time. And so I try to show respect for people, like let them see the data, let them understand it, put it in ways that sometimes the data is hard to understand, to really use visualizations and all kinds of stuff. Make it, I don't say snackable, but make it so people can understand it better. I think that's helpful. And I respect that people aren't, I respect that they're smart. And you didn't ask me my last question. When people ask me that question, and they have, my answer is go fuck yourself. Like, it's none of your friggin' business how I raised my 4 kids, but I'm here, so just it's none of your business. And so I don't suffer fools in that regard, because if they don't got the message by now, they really deserve to have their, you know, I don't want to use the word slap, but after this Will Smith thing. But
yes, well, after your after that kind of slap, though, I'm sure many people do, even for a moment, think again.
You could always do a verbal, you know, you can do a verbal thing. But I think it's like, you're an adult. You're asking me this question. And I think that's what's important. But I think getting it out there in a more discernible way, and getting to the really important data, which is from the people who are collecting all our data, is really going to be very eye-opening if those bills pass.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kara Swisher, Katie Kaufman, and Kumsal Bayazit. I'm going to turn it over to the co-director of the Harvard Data Science Initiative, David Parks, to bring us home.
Okay, thank you, Deanna, for leading such an important conversation. And many thanks to Kumsal, to Katie, to Kara for sharing your insights. As Deanna said, I'm David Parks. I'm one of the 2 co-faculty chairs of the Data Science Initiative. I thought I would just reflect a little bit on some of the things that I heard, and then wrap. So as Katie said, it's going to be so important that we recognize talent and excellence in all different styles, and we can find better ways to bring all voices to the table, which involves rewarding people in the right way, trying to nudge people. I think we heard a lot of discussion about the need for systems, organizational systems, to get to better outcomes. We heard Kumsal talking a lot about this, actually, including the hard work that Elsevier is doing to diversify science. And the stakes are huge. As Kara said, it makes no sense that as little as 2% of the dollars invested in VC-backed startups in the US are going to women. 2%. And then I also appreciated our panelists pointed out the need to be able to have real discussions and the importance of authenticity in the workplace. There's an opportunity to drive change here, but just like it's hard to make important decisions, it's hard to build the right organizational systems. And it's hard to use analytics in the right way to drive decisions, to get to better decisions. And if we use analytics in the wrong way, we can create more damage. I like to think that the difference between one biased person and one biased algorithm is scale. Hopefully, one biased person will affect a small number of people. One biased algorithm can easily affect tens of millions of individuals. And as we've heard from our panelists, using analytics is way, way more difficult than taking a data set, using machine learning and fitting a model and deploying the model. To worry about causal validity, human factors. We heard about this again from Kumsal, and the problem with data that simply reflects the status quo. So just to close, thank you again. This was a really wonderful conversation. And I hope that we at the Harvard Data Science Initiative will keep finding ways to carry this conversation forward. I hope that academia can find the right role to play. And then to all of you in the audience, please keep in touch. And also, if I might, just please find ways to drive change in your own communities as well. With that, over and out. Thanks to all of you.